Uh, Thanks everyone for joining us for Driving Towards Equity, a part of Education Reform Now's ongoing BELO's Conversation webinar series. Today we'll be discussing our new report, analyzing state American Rescue Plan plans, how the content of state plans compares to what folks are seeing in states and districts, and how advocates can use these findings to continue to fight for an equitable student-centered recovery using federal relief funds. I'm Nicholas Munyan-Penney, Senior Policy Analyst at Education Reform Now. I'll be providing a brief overview of the report and its findings, and then I'll turn it over to Beth Hawkins, senior writer at the 74, who will introduce our panel and moderate the discussion. So now on to the report. As you may know, as a part of ARP, states were required to submit their plans for the use of funds to the department in order to receive their final third of funds. Plans were due to the department in June of last year and were finally all approved by the department earlier this month. Our analysis of the plans is grounded in the belief that states have a key role to play in ensuring that ARP funds are directed and spent efficiently, effectively, actively, a role that we find states are largely falling short on. As a part of this analysis, we gave states a traffic light rating based on the proportion of criteria that each state met. Overall, just 7 states, Colorado, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and Utah received a green light, while half of states received a yellow light, and the remaining 19 received a red light. One key point here, like real traffic signals, these ratings represent just a snapshot in time. Traffic lights change, and so should state plans. These are living documents, and states have until the end of 2024 to spend their ARP dollars. Therefore, we view this report as a key opportunity to use our findings and the work of our partners to engage families, communities, school and district leaders, and state policymakers to ensure funds are targeted, used for evidence-based interventions, and monitored to inform continued adjustments to implementation. So some of our key findings. First, on a more positive note, states writ large have committed to using data to inform their recovery. 40 states clearly outline the types of data they plan to use to identify the impacts of the pandemic, and 38 states outline specific supports they are providing for districts to do the same. For instance, South Carolina developed the Rally tool for districts to use and identify student needs and set goals for academic recovery. However, we do remain concerned that a lack of academic assessment data, given low participation rates in assessments across the country last year, will limit states' ability to effectively gain a full picture of student needs. Second, stakeholder and community engagement was decidedly inconsistent across the country, which is something that ERN and others advocated to be included in the law as well as in state applications, and it's critical to ensure plans reflect the needs of students and communities. 43 states said that they consulted all of the groups that were required by ARP, including civil rights organizations. We saw that number rise considerably between initial submission of the plans and when they were approved by ED. But we are concerned that much of this engagement was simply more of a box checking exercise rather than genuine engagement. I spoke to Carrie Rodriguez from the National Parents Union earlier this week. Experts of that conversation will be on our website later in the week. She confirmed a lot of our concerns about this. That being said, some states like Colorado did demonstrate pretty strong stakeholder engagement. They actually delayed the initial submission of their plan in order to contract with an external vendor to conduct surveys and focus groups to develop the plan. Third, states really appear to be turning a blind eye to equitable distribution of ARP funds. For instance, just 5 states said that districts would need to explain how they were planning to equitably distribute funds to schools within their district based on student need, limiting our insights and ability to hold districts accountable for addressing the needs of students most in need of support. And then finally, probably most importantly, we're finding that states are really just abdicating their role in ensuring an effective and equitable use of these funds. 7 states didn't outline any plans for their use of state funds in their state plan. 6 other states just had a laundry list of potential investments, but not really a clear strategy. And an additional 12 states simply plan to just pass all of their funds onto districts, basically eliminating their ability to have a hand in how state money is invested. And all that adds up to fully half of states. And when it comes to districts, no states outlined a comprehensive strategy for monitoring the implementation of these district plans. And without such monitoring and enforcement, we're really concerned that low quality plans and poorly implemented interventions will just simply slip through the cracks. So while these findings are pretty discouraging, plans are designed to be living documents, as I mentioned, something the department has emphasized. So we're hoping that these findings and other resources, such as the Advocacy Hub that was launched today with the help of Christine Pitts, one of our panelists, we hope it will spur conversations and advocacy at the state and district level to really ensure funds are targeted and used in evidence-based interventions and are being monitored. And while I'm not on the panel today, I'm happy to have follow-up conversations with folks about our findings. And with that, I will turn it over to Beth of the 74. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you, Nicholas. That was a great overview. I'm so excited to be here, and this is a rock star panel. And I can tell you, because I had the opportunity to write a story about the report that we published yesterday, that there's a great deal of interest in it. So thanks everyone for making the time on a Wednesday afternoon. I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Senator Teresa Ruiz, who is the New Jersey Senate Majority Leader, and for more than a decade was the head of that state legislature's Education Committee. Terra Wallin is the Associate Director for P12 Federal Policy at the Education Trust. Shirline Wilson is the Director of Education Reform Now, Washington. And Dr. Christine Pitts is a Resident Policy Fellow at the Center for Reinventing Public Education. Welcome, everyone. I thought maybe we would go from the general to the specific, at least for a portion of our discussion. So, Terra, let's start with you. Based on what you've seen and heard so far, what are states and school districts doing to address unfinished learning?
Sure. I'm happy to get us started and look forward to hearing from other panelists as well. I mean, I think I want to just reemphasize, I think some of the resources that launched today with the Education Recovery Hub and then ERN's report are good places for people to refer back to and look at what some states are doing. But I think, I appreciate that you use the word unfinished learning. That's how we at the Education Trust think about this, right? We think about this is something we haven't finished, and ultimately learning is never finished, but there is an opportunity to help students and educators make up for some of the time that was lost. And frankly, some of the opportunities that were lost over the last 2 years as schools face remote learning and fits and starts, to be quite honest, and in-person learning, which I think we've all seen and felt over the last few weeks. So I think what we have seen is last year we really focused on what is the research, what does the evidence say about the strategies that work to address unfinished learning, particularly for students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, English learners, students with disability, students experiencing homelessness, those populations that we know were disproportionately impacted by COVID. COVID impacted everyone's education, but we know that there are some people it hit harder than others. And so how do we think about tailoring resources? And what we found in our research and the briefs we put out is that we highlighted 3 big strategies. One was around targeted intensive tutoring. And that tutoring has to meet a rigorous bar. It has to be small groups, 4 or less students per educator. It has to be trained and supported tutors. Students should be with the same tutor throughout the course of the school year, meeting frequently, using some kind of skills or standard-based curriculum. And so we were really clear, we're going to hear the word tutoring a lot, but there is evidence-based targeted intensive tutoring, and then there are other things people call tutoring that don't meet that standard. So we highlighted targeted intensive tutoring, high quality expanded learning time, which can look different in different places. It could be on adding time during the school day, could be on what are breaks in the school year for those that aren't on some kind of year-round calendar. It could be involving weekends, but again, has to meet that kind of rigorous bar and be standards-based and consistent. And then we also focus a lot on the importance of building strong relationships between adults and students. In some cases, that's rebuilding, and in some cases, to be honest, it's building for the first time. But I think people think relationships just happen. And what the research shows is you actually have to devote resources and make time during the day you have to create that space for adults and students to bond and build a relationship, because otherwise things like targeted intensive tutoring or expanding learning time aren't going to produce better outcomes if there aren't strong foundations at the base of that work. And so what I will see have seen most across states is a focus on targeted intensive tutoring of those strategies. We know at least 17 states have committed in some form to investing in targeted intensive tutoring. At least 5 are trying or have built some kind of statewide program, and at least 6-ish are providing state level guidance or support for more locally driven targeted intensive tutoring programs. I'll highlight 2 quickly. I think Colorado is a state that actually passed state legislation around a targeted intensive tutoring program. The law requires that it meets many of those research-based elements I just talked about. And I think the other really important thing they did is they're providing funding on a per student basis, but they're prioritizing districts that have a high number of rural students, that have a high number of students from low income backgrounds, other students who are hit hardest by the pandemic, right? They're thinking about where are the places that need the support the most first. And then I think Louisiana is taking a slightly different approach, and that they're providing really robust guidance and technical assistance from the state level. So lots of professional development for educators and school leaders, lots of examples, research around how districts can think about setting up some of those programs or participating in some state programs. But those are really 2 different ways of thinking about how a state can do this. And we're seeing, we'd love to see 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico all doing that. We're not quite there yet, but we are seeing the early starts of it.
Thank you. That's terrific. Christine, that's a tidy segue to asking you from the national view that you occupy. You've tracked plans in 100 districts and 50 states plus. And I'm wondering what some of the commonalities you've noted are.
Yeah, I mean, I think like Nicholas mentioned, we just launched the Education Recovery Hub this morning, which is a partnership with Edunomics and the Collaborative for Student Success. What's exciting about the hub is that we were looking for promising and innovative practices. So where states and LEAs are really creating these comprehensive packages of investments that kind of speak to one another, that will make sure the investments are held to account in the long run. The 2 states that stand out for me as I was looking at the database this morning, thinking about this, was Georgia and Connecticut. And this goes back to some of what Terra and Nicholas have already said about data. We know that it's so important for us to center data, because doing that actually helps us center the lived experiences of our students and families in this pathway to recovery. It helps us address that K-shaped recovery that we know we're seeing in many of our communities. So Georgia and Connecticut have both invested in research and evaluation partnerships from the onset of the American Rescue Plans. That really sets a tone across the state that we care about telling the story about these investments, that at some point we're going to see studies released, analyses of the efficacy of these different interventions. Like Terra mentioned, if you have a statewide approach to tutoring, high dosage tutoring, or if you're making investments in learning acceleration and you're setting objective criteria, making sure the right kids are receiving those services, the students who really need it. I think we want to know, did that pay off in the long run? And Georgia and Connecticut have kind of, set the tone that that's going to be a priority for them.
So Teresa, Christine just named a couple of positive outliers, states that took their accountability role seriously, or at least, there's a promising sign that they will take it seriously. My understanding is that you have been critical of New Jersey's planning on that level, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So thank you for having me. And it's Teresa, but if you can't roll the R, Teresa's fine. First of all, I'm so happy to be on here because late last week we were having kind of a planning session and figuring out what state is doing this great. And then yesterday when I got the article and saw the map, I had staff call these states, get their plans. Let's figure out why reinvent the wheel if in fact there are people that are doing this in its best place. Precisely what you all are focused on right now is something that I attempted to do legislatively during the pandemic process. but instead put budget language in the budget bill at the end of our session last year with funding in it. And I don't recall the entirety of all of it because it was very nuanced and making sure that we could get desegregated data and all that kind of information. But the focus of it was because remember, the feds are asking states and or districts to report how they're spending the money from a financial point of view, but they're not asking people to accumulate this information on the return on its investment. And so what I don't want to see happen in any state is for people to come back and say, hey, so-and-so wasted $60 million on underwater basket weaving. And guess what? It didn't work. Well, it's too late. I really wanted like a real-time apparatus that would help kind of govern the public space in the state through the Department of Education. So we put language in there. We put financing behind it to support it, and it pretty much just directed the Department of Education to seek out a partner that would be able to conduct this kind of research component. What different districts were doing, how are they utilizing the money? Is District A doing one-on-one tutoring? Is that working? Or to be able to say to them, hey, you need to reach back out to them, put the pause because they're spending money, and by the time everything gets done, it will be wasted. I believe they're in the process of 7 or 8 months later formulating a document with an entity to get that done. But for me, the partnership with whomever it is that they select in that process should be one that doesn't stop just in this time frame, but continues to work with the department kind of to see best practices and to see if we're actually moving the needle. You know, it's interesting that learning loss has become a tagline or a point that everyone understands. When I was elected over a decade ago and talking about it, I think people thought it was only something which was probably true that impacted my constituency. But I recall first couple of months into the pandemic, colleagues calling me, what are you going to do about the learning loss scenario that's facing the entire state? And it wasn't until COVID that kind of, I think, a legislative agenda that has been crippling communities, Black and Latino communities for decades got elevated into a space. And for the first time, and this is where I see the light at the end of the tunnel, we have a once in a lifetime opportunity, at least here in the state of New Jersey, not to solely attempt to bring kids back up to speed, because I'll be curious to see how much damage COVID did. This year will be our first cycle that we go back to the state assessment test and then go back to 2019 and see what the gap is, and to see how much wider it got, if it got that much wider at all, because I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't grow that much more extensively, because this is something we've been grappling with. But for the first time, not solely bring all children who are in need back up to speed academically, socially, emotionally, but to stand up in the country and say this nomenclature of us being the #1 public schools in the country is not something that we're going to claim because it's a fallacy and it's not true for every child, but that we are closing the achievement gap because with this federal funding, we moved the needle 3 or 4 points. To me, that is where the focus is, because I don't know about any other state, but we have a crippling crisis here in New Jersey, and one that I don't think has a sense of urgency and fire that's critically needed. And I will stop here because I could go on for 7 hours on this right point.
Thank you. Shirline, you have pressed Washington with some success to make changes to its plan. Can you talk to us about your racial equity planning process?
You bet. And thanks for asking, Beth. I mean, I think that one of the things that a lot of us on the policy advocacy front, as the federal government guidance was coming out on ARPA, we're studying to identify opportunities for collaboration, advocacy, and partnership with the state. And so as that guidance was coming out, we were reaching out to the various levels of policy actors, whether that was in the executive branch or the legislative branch or in, our state school chiefs. So one of the outcomes of that was being able to influence with a collaboration with roughly 25 other organizations, including the Education Trust as well, at the state level, as well as some of our state's biggest funders, to actually adopt an equity framework and tool. And so that collaborative of work that ERN led resulted in that getting a mention in our state plan. And then also with unlocking some very important local community state partnership funding. And so that advocacy effort supported that connection to community, and I think resulted in strengthening our plan. We have a long way to go. There's as you saw in your analysis, Washington State's plan has some opportunities for improvement, but this was actually one of, I think, the bright spots in that whole process of crisis response.
So I have two quick follow-ups for you, Shirline. One is whether that means that the state plan is one of the ones that's effective or considered promising in terms of directing resources equitably.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that it's the start, and it's a model, and it's one that we want to continue to reinforce. I think the piece that I think would actually really round this out is what we are working on now, which is creating a two-way relationship with the state agencies, with the legislature and the executive branch, so that we can actually continue to pull feedback from community so that we know what's working, what's not, and then we have the material to course correct. So, that's how we'll know that this is effective. The creation of the state plans, I think, was a start, and now we're modeling an orientation of partnership that results in things like, when the schools at Washington, one of our partners on the ground and nonprofits who participates in a consortium is trying to get dollars to get closer to community for extended care and aftercare services, or the College Success Foundation, for example, another collaborative partnership that's also making sure that there are mentors in high schools that are ready to support students in their college going journey. We still have a big gap around what are we doing about learning recovery, as you heard from others who are evaluating across the state. And so what partners are we supporting that are working on unfinished learning, for example, and how do we bring those folks into our collaborative and make sure that state agencies understand that that work needs to be prioritized, whether that's legislatively or in a budget vehicle or through a state local partnership.
Teresa, you said that you heard from a number of your colleagues. Does that mean that they're hearing from their constituents? Is there a public hunger to have the voices of constituents elevated?
I think so. The unfortunate thing that kind of fire that was very early on, as districts started opening up and other districts had a better sense of normalcy, and for the most part, these were more suburban districts that were opening while our urban districts remained closed. I think that sense of urgency from the unlike partner has been quieted a little bit. It's the thing that when everyone's in the same salad bowl, we all treat each other equally. But as soon as there's an opportunity to kind of climb out, you forget what the experience was when you were inside of the bowl. And I keep reminding everyone that sense of urgency that we had in those first couple of months, recognizing that it didn't matter where you lived, that you needed to have access to technology and bandwidth to log into a classroom setting. Otherwise, you couldn't even begin to say that you were going to school. Kind of has dissipated to some degree because some districts are moving along, and they're probably high performing districts or resource families that recognize that, my child was impacted in the last 2 years, but now I am hiring a tutor in these specific scenarios, or I have a counselor talking to them if it's a social or an emotional need, or I'm going to resource in this way because they're not going to allow that child to fail. My families don't want our children to fail either. We are just concerned about paying the rent and putting food on the table. And I feel sometimes that we come from this voice that's not heard because we feel that if the school is providing it, then that's it. I always remember my father, whenever someone would call him, or if the insurance company, he was having this discussion, whatever it was that the person told him on the phone, he took for, God's word. Oh, this is it. This is what it is. And I think that sometimes our families feel that way, almost grateful for what they're being given and not understanding that this is a constitutional right in this state, and that there is a huge time ticking bomb right now that is really facing. I'll give you this. The one upside that we did in the state was because we had a shift because we shifted and didn't take the spring assessments that we usually do, the state did implement an intro assessment that was called Start Strong, and really created a framework that I hope we keep in perpetuity, because it's more in real time. It helps the teacher, it helps the family, and it can help the student for the upcoming year. So I hope that we continue to do that 10 years from now, to collect that data point. But what was striking is that they did a presentation to the State Board of Education, and I focus on fourth graders because we all know on this call that third grade is the critical year, right? Third grade sets you up for the rest of your life. I tell people who don't understand in the space, from prenatal to 3, you learn to read. From 3 until career and college and life and whatever, you're reading to learn. And so I focused on the fourth grade component. Nearly 40% of the general population in the state are in need of strong support. I relate that to undergrade level. I think that's the category that's closest to it. 40% of the general population in both math and English. When you peel back, it's 75%, and from what I can recall, but it's 75% Latino, 76% of our African American communities. If that is not the biggest thing to make everybody get up out of their seats and say, we are creating a pipeline to a lifetime of lost wages, terrible living conditions, not improving the quality of life, eliminating general wealth, and a direct doorway into the criminal justice system, I don't know what else I can say to kind of tell people something very courageous, bold has to happen. And what I do think, to the question that you said, are people are more open to this? I believe that traditional stakeholders who would be against trying new things are more invested in attempting to be creative at this moment, because the numbers are so stark and no one is catching the blame for it. The pandemic is catching the blame for it, right? So if this is not, we're not doing what we should be doing, and it's because of the supervisors or the principals or the classroom professionals, it's because of this bigger thing that nobody was prepared for. So I do think that we have a key opportunity here to bring everyone to the table and to try some really extraordinary things. And the biggest thing that we have, that usually when we say, oh, we should pilot a year-round academic calendar, let's just see, let's see what district wants to try this, and then we can get data from it to see if it works. Usually the response is, we don't have money. That's not an issue right now. There is so much money. So let's figure out how we can best, create the return on the investments on these dollars.
Christine, I've used your database and followed spending plan creation in several districts. And I would say anecdotally, my takeaway is that at the local level, leaders are often surprised that the community has opinions about the spending and the recovery plans. And I'm wondering what you see reflected in the district and state plans that you've analyzed.
Yeah, so earlier I commented on some of the promising and innovative approaches. I'm going to go to the other side now and think about the areas for improvement, right? So I'll go back to what Teresa just said, which is that when the pandemic started in March, there was a lot of talk about this kind of new era of education. Can we use this opportunity to be entrepreneurial, innovative, create new pathways for new school delivery models? And the reality is, across SERP's scans, we're not really seeing investments in those approaches. And that's concerning. And it's not just in the investments. Across our research communities as well, we're seeing kind of a dearth of studies on true R&D coming out of COVID. And if we're going to build this path towards recovery, we need to really center those innovations. And there's an important reason for that is that a lot of those innovations during the pandemic, it was a co-production with families, with community partners, things like learning hubs. We saw families and communities centered in a brand new way. And a lot of people are kind of saying, let's completely redefine the way that we have worked together. Unfortunately, when it comes to these investments and the systems, it's like we're falling back to the status quo in many cases. I think it's really critical that we kind of develop a cohesive R&D agenda to uplift, to scale, and systematize some of those innovations that we saw emerge from our communities in the last 2 years.
Tara, let's follow up on this with you. One of the reports says that one of the things that happened when USED, the U.S. Education Department, reviewed preliminary plans was that there was some back and forth over community engagement, and that at least on the checking the box level, that element of most of the plans was strengthened. Do you see meaning in that? Do you see anybody who went back and said, wow, we got this feedback that we didn't hit the mark, let's start fresh?
I wish I had a more positive answer for that, but I don't think we've seen a ton of concrete examples for that. I want to acknowledge, to state's credit, this was a tight timeline in terms of once they were actually told what they needed to submit to access funding that we thought was really critical and people needed right away. There wasn't a ton of time in that timeline, to be quite honest, from a bureaucracy standpoint, to do this in a way that I think we would like to see. I think one of the things I heard folks talking about earlier was really feedback loops and the fact that these are supposed to be living documents, right? The funding has to be kind of committed to something by late 2024 and then spent by early 2025. That's 3 years from now. And so what are states doing in the interim? Because the other thing is, we all know this, our circumstances continue to change, right? From day to day or week to week, depending on where you're at. And so these plans need to be updated. So I think I don't know if it's worth how much it's worth spending all of our time to figure out what happened 6 months ago in order for states to access the fund, but it is worth thinking about what this looks like moving forward. And so I think there's a couple of things I'd highlight. One, of the ARP funding, about 90% is flowing down to the district level. And I think one of the things that came out in the ERN report, and I think you heard from Senator Ruiz, is states in some cases haven't done as much as they could be doing to either provide guidance, provide technical assistance, provide templates, provide tools, or be more directive, depending on their authority within the state, to make sure this funding is going to the students who need it the most and that it's going towards evidence-based practices. So I think there is still an opportunity for states to be doing that. But also what we saw in some places is that states played a more active role in ensuring that districts were meeting their stakeholder engagement obligations. And because we know when you have buy-in from the community, you're more likely to be successful. And so we saw a state like Tennessee, who at least in their template had people actually describe what their stakeholder engagement looked like, what kind of feedback they heard, what changes they made to their plan as a reflection of that feedback. And then we saw a lot of other states that asked districts to check a box that said you reached out to XYZ groups of people that you're required to reach out to by law. Those are two very different ways of thinking about the value of community voice and actually bringing that to reality. And so I think we are going to continue to push advocates to continue asking questions in their local board meeting, and their local superintendent, to their elected official, to their state education agency, because these funds are still out there. And I think the other thing, just to pick up on something I'm seeing both in the chat and the Q&A and hearing multiple people talk about, and I know Christine, I think, wrote something for the 74 about this that maybe we can link around the state assessment data. State assessment data is not the only data point that matters. We saw data come out in Washington recently to be, my perception was that the state didn't put much much credence to what that data necessarily said. And I think there are still things that could be drawn from it. We saw New Jersey change how they did assessments, and, so it has a different set of data, or really lack of some statewide data available, but that pushed innovation in other ways. These plans should be updated over time to reflect new data that we're gathering. And that's both assessment data and other data. What do surveys of families and communities look like? What new needs are they identifying? What needs are they showing that have been met? We've talked a lot about access to nutrition, access to technology, and we've seen changes in those things over the last 2 years. How are people gathering new data to figure out what needs are being met and what needs aren't being met? I just think it's really important that we don't think of this as just a retrospective on stakeholder engagement. This should be an ongoing thing, no matter the time or place, and it's the opportunity is not over.
Can I just jump in on something that too, because I'm sure this is something that's facing all of our spaces and our states. As you say, what are the other things that are a key component? Look, we have a teacher shortage throughout this country, and in areas where we knew it was very difficult to staff up, specifically in ELLs and special ed. bilingual and in the maths and the sciences, which have been a trajectory. This is another space where there has to be kind of this data collection so that we know exactly. So it isn't kind of like, oh, you know, this district is missing. It's how many teachers are we really missing in these spaces? Because certainly if now and not always, we can't afford to have a classroom who hasn't been exposed to some specific subject matter have someone in a substitute in perpetuity. And this is not unique to New Jersey. This is something that faces the country. I do say that while a lot of this responsibility falls on the state, because it was, I believe, short-sighted on behalf of the federal government not to have generated a more uniformed approach specifically, or giving the states some kind of checkpoint mechanism. As Tara said, a lot of the money went specifically to the districts. So you may have districts that'll turn around and say, you don't have the authority to tell me. I keep arguing, you know, when you can't legislate someone into doing something, you publicly push them in that direction. Because I think if a state has a strong fundamental plan where parents really, you know, parents are the ones, parents saw this firsthand. This becomes a childcare issue, right? This is not, never mind even understanding the academic shortfalls that are facing our kids. This becomes a childcare issue where every family member is connecting to this. When you get those constituencies around a plan that say, this is what we're at least going to have as a minimum benchmark across the board, that you're going to do this, this, and this. If you have percentages of students that are falling behind, that will trigger it. Regardless as to what the authority of that State Department or the administration has, I think that every school district would fall in line, because the perception of not doing so will mean that they're not supporting their kids, if that makes sense. Sorry.
Oh, that's a terrific comment. Very well received. And we have just a couple more minutes before we're going to open this up to audience questions. And I know somebody is collating those. Shirline, you are the advocate on the ground on the panel. And I'm wondering what your reaction is to what Teresa just said, and what your plans are for applying pressure as the spending goes forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for asking. I was just sitting here going, okay, we need 5 more Teresa Ruiz as legislative leaders in our state. And so I think that, you know, cultivating and great legislative champions, I think still remains one of our key advocacy tools in our toolkit. But the work of being in right relationship to community so that we can actually help them to frame and understand what's going on and how they do have the base of power, that continues to be you know, an area for advocates to really continue to excel in, right? We're in our communities, or we're through partnerships in our communities, we're asking what they want, we're creating that feedback mechanism and making sure they understand the process itself and that they are empowered to speak on behalf of what their communities need. And that needs to continue to be a top priority for advocates like mine and anybody who does state advocacy work.
Well, you're incredibly prescient, because you've just answered in part the first question from the audience, which is what mechanisms exist to push yellow and red states to better use funds. And you have been addressing this in the chat. Tara, do you have anything to add, or anyone else for that matter, in terms of how we can get more reds and yellows to green?
I think folks on the ground know this, right? I think we at national type organizations have spent time thinking about what tools we can generate for advocates. And so because we're one step removed, but we have this ability to see across states, right? Because we're not doing the on the ground in an individual place. We've been trying to lift up these examples, right? I do think there's also something, states have some competition when it comes to education, right? And sometimes we like to know, hey, this state over here, this is what they're doing, and these are the types of outcomes they're seeing. And I do think that's a role where a national organization or nonprofits can also lift up some of those things and share them. I think this goes with what Senator Ruiz is saying, which is, you know, publicly pushing. And there's different ways to do that, and comparisons matter in a lot of situations. And so that's one of the things we think about doing as well, and giving parents and advocates on the ground those examples so they can walk into the district or state office and say, hey, this is what this other place is doing. There's no reason we can't do this if you're willing to put your political capital behind it.
Senator, there's a follow-up to that directed to you, which is how can advocates support elected officials who are trying to ensure these funds are used for the greatest impact?
So I think that if pieces of legislation come out, they could always get engaged, and not so much, directing it at the office that's being supported, but sending the messages to people who may be apprehensive in this space. In this case, I'm also on this panel to learn, because I want to get all these plans from the green states. You asked the question, I too want to ask the question, how do I get my state from red to green, right? But in an effective way, because the last thing we want to see is a plan that looks good on paper and doesn't permeate into real tangible growth for students, right? So there has to be those things in place. I think that, so it's hugely frustrating, because I feel oftentimes that my voice becomes the nagging voice in the state, where it becomes like it's not as important because it's not unique and it's not new. What would be interesting to see is to hear from different types of people who usually do not talk about the issues that some of us have been talking about for a decade. And oftentimes that, unfortunately, it's the nature of what it is. It elevates that conversation, and then more people start paying attention. Be supportive of innovative legislation. Demand of your school district, if in fact that is the only thing that you can do, is to understand that no one in the space is doing your child a favor. This is something that is owed to our children. This is something that is expected and should be guaranteed. And so that's the modality that has to change as far as some of our constituencies. And I think you'll see greater voices elevating in that space. I'm trying to figure out how I get my state to move from, I'm still thinking in the space, I may take out billboards throughout the entire state and just put up that 4th grade assessment outcome and, draw the lines to income, draw the lines to all the outcomes that it may have to. And maybe that will bring constituencies up to the greater fold. I'm not so sure everyone, if you're an advocate in the space, I'm not so sure every single mother realizes what is happening. And it's not because of lack of will, love, or want, it's just because of circumstance.
Christine, have you seen in plans a mechanism for states to revise, or are states discussing that in their plans?
This is such an important question that we are not talking about largely, is this idea, Terra mentioned it a little bit, of like adapting our plans. The US Department of Education, even though they've kind of abdicated like any kind of accountability, they have said and been upfront that the plans are living documents, and they want to see revisions as circumstances change and as we hear from communities over time. So I have seen some plans kind of nod to this. There was, I think Wyoming, or there was a state who released a second plan on their website that had made some initial changes to some of the investments. That was promising. But largely we're not seeing it. And this goes back to this question of kind of little a accountability, like the advocates, the boots on the ground, the families who are walking into school buildings. I keep thinking as a mom myself, when I go into my kid's classroom someday, when I'm allowed to again, after, we can, am I going to see these investments like with my own eyes? Am I going to hear them? And I keep thinking like, that's what I want our parents to be asking when they're in schools. And that's something that we need to kind of maintain. In the absence of big A accountability at that federal level, we need to be holding these funds to account in some way like that.
So we have, I'm assuming that the Shavar mentioned in this question is Shavar Jeffries. So we're going to call it the $125 billion question. He asks, how do we persuade public officials in charge of education systems, governors, mayors, superintendents, to leverage this moment for bold, innovative ideas that might transform education, as opposed to using resources for more of the same? Small topic. Who wants the first bite at it?
I'll get us started. I feel like that there will be better answers to come. But I will say as a fierce advocate, particularly for students of color and students from low-income backgrounds, we are also very cognizant of what the day-to-day looks like in some places right now. and appreciate the immediate challenges, right? You're trying to keep the doors open. You're trying to make sure kids are getting the food, that you have the bus drivers that are able to get those kids to school. And I think the staffing issues that we heard Senator Ruiz talk about are real, right? They existed before, they've only been exacerbated. So I think part of that is we've been thinking about what's some of the work we can do, right? And part of this is bringing those transformative examples where they exist with proof of concept, proof that they've worked and that they've worked with similar communities or in similar contexts. I think that's the other thing that happens is often we identify great practices, we send it and say, here, you can do this. And it doesn't at all match what the community needs or the community context or the resources that are available to that community. And so how do we make those connections between transformative practices, but that are geared towards the types of communities that we're talking to? I think part of the challenge, as I think Christine said this earlier, is we don't always have good evidence. We don't always have great data on outcomes that extends beyond state standardized tests. And so I want to say before I forget, right, like some of this ARP funding can be used for some of those foundational shifts that we need. It can be used to build a P to 16 data system, right? We're seeing California go through this huge undertaking of building this data system that connects their childcare, early learning, all the way through their K-12 system up into their higher ed system. There are initial outlay costs that are high and take human capacity, and states and districts have resources to do that right now. I really hope states use this opportunity to build some of those things that will provide the information advocates need to put some of this pressure on elected officials, to be quite honest, right? Like that's one step behind, but it's an important part of the conversation.
Can I add to that, Shavar? Thank you for the question, my neighbor. I just want to highlight something. This is not only holding local electeds and state electeds and anyone that you think is in the space. This is about this country as a whole. Let's not all sit here and pretend to think that the United States has been cognizant of what is facing our schools pre-pandemic or during the pandemic, and that they've been going all out to fix this. It is very rare that you find a president that even speaks about education in their State of the Union addresses, never mind just dealing with any kind of policy shift in their agenda. It is a joke in this country to say that we are a first power and to rank internationally in the double digits, because we've never made a true investment in our education systems. We still go to school on an agrarian calendar. That is a joke. We still have buildings that were built under Abraham Lincoln's administration that opened their doors to students, and unbeknownst to them, they think it's the best place in the world, but you and I know that it's not the most conducive place for learning. So this level of accountability is for everyone. This country needs to recognize that you want to talk about all the other issues facing inequity, healthcare, access to jobs, access to a safe learning environment, to drinking water. Everything for me always starts in the classroom. Everything will always begin and end in the classroom. Give a child an opportunity to walk into a space where they can reach their optimal potential. Then I will give you a well-rounded taxpayer that's committed to their community at the end of the day. Until we switch our thinking and understanding that these investments have to be made early on, this country, our states, and our communities will be paying on the back end 3 times the fold, because we still can't understand it. And until we start accepting that 180-day calendar system, because it's hot or it's cold or it's whatever, it's the United States of America. Why doesn't every single classroom have an air conditioning? And these are the things that just blow my mind. It's 2022. These are the things that, unless you start talking about this and elevating it in a space to realize that people who are in charge from the top all the way on down to say, you're right, we've never made a commitment to our ed spaces in this country, and we're going to turn around this conversation, then I think we'll still be spinning our cycles in I call it the Scooby-Doo syndrome for anybody who watched that. They take off and they just stay in the same spot because we repeat everything over and over and over again. I changed tenure in the state of New Jersey, and it was Obama's, I think, first State of the Union address, and he talked about teacher quality. That was the first time I heard a sitting president say that, and I'm jumping up and down like, at least someone has my back when I go into this, but then things kind of just fell off. We just saw this huge bill that didn't make it through, but does everybody know this infrastructure bill didn't have $1 in it for school construction? Come on. Where are we really committed to in this country and in our states?
From that very impassioned statement to a very pragmatic question, I'm not quite sure whether this is better directed at Christine or Terra, but Christine, let's start with you. Districts are exploring virtual tutoring options, some of which have no evidence base of effectiveness. So they're proposing to use things that have not worked so far in the pandemic to make up the unfinished learning. How can we support states and localities in finding high quality tutoring?
Yeah, so the virtual piece here is really important, right? I think we need to like mentally separate the emergency distance learning that happened during COVID, because we immediately went to online learning and we're like scrambling, right? For pedagogical reasons, like technology reasons, access to broadband, access to devices. We need to separate that from virtual learning moving forward. But we can learn from some of the things that went wrong and some of the things that were pretty cool and useful in those situations. So I think we need to separate those two things. We're no longer doing emergency learning. We can't do that anymore. It was harmful to our students. From there, we need to make investments into that R&D portfolio that I talked about. You know, we need to be studying the efficacy of some of these different programs. And many of those programs are co-produced with families with different, innovative thinkers who are not just thinking about school and learning in a four-wall school building, right? I think these investments right now, it's really important for us to kind of balance that investment in the innovative, in the new school delivery options, while also centering the rebuilding of relationships between students and families, and even with teachers, student to teacher relationships. And what's interesting, Beth, is that our school districts, a lot of them actually did collect school climate and culture surveys during COVID because it was such an important topic. I know I was working in a school district last year and we actually did phone banking. We were calling families to get the information from them about the services that they needed. These are the data that can provide that more comprehensive visual and picture that we need to be using to address, how we design virtual learning tutoring programs moving forward.
So I lose the gavel in 4 minutes. So this is going to be a lightning round because we've got two really good questions teed up. The first is, how do we assess what works in terms of interventions?
I mean, that's a big question. I will say, I think just a couple important considerations. I think one, academic data matters. That can be data from state assessments, that can be data from formative or interim assessments, depending, we know different places are doing different things, but it also includes the type of other things that Christine was just alluding to. That could be survey-based. There are differences in qualities of surveys. So I'm not saying just go pull a survey off the internet and use that to assess quality, but there are a lot of people thinking about this. So, and I think we have to think of that gamut, right? We know we need to be thinking about students' social, emotional well-being, and we want to know that they're on track to read at their grade level, or that they're on track to pursue whatever college or career of their choosing that will lead to an economically viable livelihood, right? And so we have to think broadly about what those measures are. That requires us to be collecting data now. I think it also, we alluded to this example of Connecticut about this partnership between researchers and school systems. It's another way people could be thinking about using some of this ARP funding, is to set up those types of relationships that we've seen in places like Chicago for a long time that have had real impacts on improving student outcomes, because they've been able to see over time what's working, where they need to pivot, what they need to change. And so I think keeping those things in mind is really important. But I think the other thing is, when we're assessing whether something works, we have to think about individual students and individual groups of students. If it works, but it only works for white wealthy students, then it does not work, right? It is not actually addressing the needs of the students that need it the most in most places. And so we have to be thinking about data disaggregation too. It can't be, there's been too long where we've said this strategy works, and if you actually look at it, it doesn't work for everyone, or there's no evidence that it works for everyone.
Christine, this is a little unfair to tee up the last question, which is from Joe. I'm assuming this is Joe Nathan. To you and tell you you have 90 seconds. Can you talk about using a student asset-based strategies if there are service learning opportunities or other things that we know are very engaging with students and allow them to burnish their skills?
Mhm.
How can we encourage that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is so important, and it gets to what I was just saying, is we need to think of students as whole human beings who are on this path forward, like through recovery into the workforce, into post-secondary. I think we need to look at all of their lived experiences, whether that's in the school building or outside of the school building. And the pandemic showed us that students can be learning not in the four walls. Like I said, we need to be incorporating that as much as possible. So I think inviting our workforce industries into this conversation, this is happening in South Carolina. There's some investments in this, inviting other industries, other partners, other stakeholders, redefining community-based organizations who are probably closer to the actual pathway forward than ever. They should be, co-producing, co-designing these programs as much as possible. And also not discounting data. So one time when we start talking about these kind of more, squishy programs that aren't necessarily focused on only academics, we oftentimes think there's not data to kind of illustrate the lived experiences. There are data out there, and we need to find ways to different types of data.
I can't believe you squoze that into the time I imposed on you. So you all can't see my messy work service, fortunately, but I've written down 50 or 60 really great story ideas, and we'll see how many of them we can get to in the next little while. But right now it is my job to turn this over to Nicholas. Nicholas, this has been terrific. I'm so pleased that you guys asked me to do this, and look forward to speaking further in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, this was an amazing conversation. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, our entire panel. This was awesome. I also want to take a quick second to thank our comms team at ERN. They've done a great job setting up this webinar and getting this report out. And thank you to state staff, including Shirline and our other state staff at ERN. They've done a great job in providing feedback throughout the entire process of the report, which has been going on for about 6 months. Be sure to check out the full report on our website, as well as reports on specific states that are our ERN chapter states. And also be on the lookout for a full recording of the webinar and also the Q&A that I mentioned with Carrie Ruiz of National Parents Union coming in the coming days. And that is all. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your afternoon.